when the West signaled its intent to leave, of course, they blamed the Afghan politicians, who in turn blamed the Afghan army, and in turn, ultimately, there was no one left to blame, and the place collapsed in very short order.
Afghanistan is in the midst of a security crisis. The US military has evacuated the country, and the capital city of Kabul has fallen into Taliban hands. What does this mean for the future of the country, as well as for the security of the region more broadly? Well, joining me to discuss is Dr. Greg Mills. He's with the Brenthurst Foundation, and he has spent a number of years advising NATO and other organizations in Afghanistan on how to rebuild the country following years of war and conflict. Greg Mills, welcome to the CRA. Could you tell our viewers, as we're speaking on Monday afternoon, what is the situation there on the ground?
Well, the situation, of course, is changing by the minute. But as of yesterday, the Taliban have retaken Kabul as a result of a campaign that they essentially started in May. And much to everyone's surprise, the Afghan National Army, police, intelligence services pretty much folded, although there was a lot of initial fighting, pretty much folded in the face of the Taliban attack. And that, of course, leads one to question fundamentally about, why they folded so quickly. What's the last 20 years of so-called state building been about? And what has been the impact of the signaling by the West and by President Biden in particular of the imminence of the Western withdrawal, which was due to take place on the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And I think personally it had tremendous impact. I think it had a tremendous negative impact on the morale of the Afghans. The Americans wanted out, and when they wanted out, NATO couldn't stay because the Americans essentially are the enablers within that alliance, and that much is clear today. And the Americans wanted out because they believed it was going to be as good as it was ever going to get. I think they didn't quite imagine that it was going to be as bad as it would become in a very short space of time. And the reason why it's so bad is that the armed forces of Afghanistan were pretty much hollowed out. And when the West signaled its intent to leave, of course, they blamed the Afghan politicians, who in turn blamed the Afghan army. And in turn, ultimately, there was no one left to blame, and the place collapsed in very short order.
Enjoying this analysis? Click here to sign up for our 30-day free trial for more content from the CIA.
But it was a big strategic mistake, in my opinion, by the United States and by President Biden, and before him, President Trump, to signal and then thus to catalyze this collapse. The Americans had just 2,500 troops in Afghanistan, but essentially they were a sort of gossamer guarantee that the situation would remain stable. When they signed the agreement with the Taliban in February this year, essentially to get out, an agreement that was signed without their allies' involvement, that is the government of Afghanistan, essentially the die was cast, and it was just a question of waiting for the collapse and the self-fulfilling prophecy of withdrawal and retreat to occur. And that's indeed what's happened today. So they've catalyzed something really that they didn't need to do, probably much to their surprise. And the consequences of this are massive, I think, for not just sort of immediate geopolitical consequences and the consequences for people, humanitarian terms inside Afghanistan, and we can talk about that, but their long-term consequences, I think, for American-led moral authority and reliability in the world. I mean, who would want to be an ally of the Americans? And the argument that, they were going to get out, so they might as well get out now, it doesn't really stack up if you think that the United States has been engaged with Germany for 3/4 of the last 100 years, and they've been in Korea for 70 years, and there's been long-term commitments to places like Cyprus as well. These are very small down payments on long-term security. And I think the fear amongst most people today is, while state building from outside is a messy and imperfect business, hardly a science, that essentially what we're going to see in 20 years' time is a redux of exactly what happened 20 years ago.
So, Greg, there's a tension here between American isolationism and multilateralism. Do you think that this has been a blow against multilateralism and also America's role, self-defined over many decades, as the policeman of the international security framework?
I mean, I think there's two questions here. One of which is, are we really seeing multilateralism in play here? I mean, this is a limited alliance. This is a NATO-led alliance. It has involved 50 countries, but it has its limits. And of course, principal players in the region, India, Pakistan, Iran, the Stans, Russia, China, they haven't really been part of this. They have been participants, but not partners. America really, I think, failed to capitalize, and the world failed to capitalize on the goodwill that existed after 9/11. And what started off life as a fairly broad-based international effort to restore security to Afghanistan in a way that ensured that another 9/11 wouldn't reoccur, that this sort of international effort dissipated the longer the mission went on, and it became more, in a sense, exclusively American as time went on. And that, I think, diluted the sense that this was a broad-based international concern. In addition to that, of course, there was the NATO component, and that, of course, then has other geopolitical dimensions to it, not least the relationship with Russia and with China. I think there's a broad question also about the extent to which the United Nations has been involved. I mean, the UN has been involved both in developmental terms in Afghanistan and also in terms of its mission, which has mainly had a humanitarian aspect to it. But the UN has been pretty, let's be kind, weak-kneed, limp-wristed in terms of actually bringing about the conditions for peace. And this is in part because there is, of course, going to be a standoff at the UN Security Council on these issues, and no doubt vetoes will fly around if the United States or Britain or France, for that matter, attempted to bring the matter before the Security Council. So there's another failure there in terms of UN multilateralism. And then there's a failure too of regionalism, because peace agreements generally are made when the international community pushes the parties to the negotiating table in more or less the same way. That's the South African experience. And of course, the parties themselves realize there's little wiggle room, that there's more to be gained from ending fighting than continuing with it. And then they produce leadership and timing and method to enable that to happen. And in this particular region, you're dealing with a very fractured country. It's topographically fractured. It's geographically under the influence of its regional neighbors, the West and the Hazara under Iran, the South and the East under Pakistan, of course, and the northern bits under the various stands. And the region has been disunited. They've all been playing their own games in shades of the great game, perhaps of the imperial times. In Afghanistan, these have been multiple games played over 2 decades now. And of course, before that, with the Russians too, during the Mujahideen phase of the 1980s. So in that sense, there's another failure of multilateralism, which is regionalism. But to your question about isolationism versus multilateralism, let's rephrase it and say isolationism versus interventionism, which is more dangerous. And I guess the history from the 20s would suggest that an isolated or isolationist United States is actually a dangerous thing, because the world needs that degree of involvement by the world's greatest economy. But it's done itself an enormous disservice, particularly in the manner of its exit now, just as it did in Vietnam in the mid-1970s. And that this isolationism is in a sense now back upon it. And you know, the notion that you can, and I think this is the claim by the United States, that you can essentially peacekeep or terrorism keep these countries like Afghanistan from a distance by using standoff remote drone capabilities and actually maintain an anti-terrorist or counter-terrorist capacity, I think is really translating what is a longer-term process of state building and turning that into a very knee-jerk kinetic action. And I think the world in 2021 should be less about dealing with people in a kinetic way and through killings, and trying to find a pathway that we can talk about development and we can talk about inclusion and partnership and creating a bigger pie. So in fact, I think the step back here has been tremendous, because we've gone from an attempt, misguided, badly managed, in every possible sense of the term, undoubtedly, but an attempt at least to assist the people of Afghanistan in a constructive, positive, reasonably benign, non-threatening way, now reverting to essentially a highly kinetic, militaristic standoff strategy, which has very little of the softer content of what we would term soft power and the discipline of assistance and development and those sorts of good things, which is a very difficult job to do, as we've just seen.
Greg Mills, thank you very much for joining us on the CRA channel. If you enjoyed this analysis, please do give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Also, let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. Do you think it was the right decision for the Biden administration to leave Afghanistan in the way that it did? My name is David Ansara. This is the CRA. Until next time, take care.